The ghost by the window. The ghost by the window continued. Carmen arrived a week later. She stuffed the plane, exhausted from the long flight, but there was something more than jet lag weighing her down. The news of her mother's death had shaken her to the core, and now she was filled with a sense of dread about returning to her childhood home. It wasn't just the grief. Something about Joel's voice on the phone had unsettled her. When Carmen pulled up to Joel and Maria's house, she immediately felt a heaviness in the air. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She noticed how rundown it had become since her last visit, with the garden overgrown and the paint on the walls peeling. She had sent so much money over the years, but it seemed none of it had gone toward taking care of their mother or the house. Joel and Maria greeted her at the door, their faces pale and weary. There was a strange, unspoken tension between them, as if they had been holding on to a dark secret. Rosa, however, didn't come out to greet her aunt. She was upstairs, as usual, sitting by the window in her grandmother's old room. "I'm so sorry, Carmen," Joel muttered as they hugged, but there was an awkwardness to his apology. It felt forced, as if he was only saying it because it was expected of him. Carmen nodded but didn't say anything. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't want to push her brother, not yet. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Carmen asked about Rosa. "She's been very quiet, hasn't she? I haven't seen her since I got here." Maria shot a quick glance at Joel before answering. "She's been through a lot," she said, her voice tight. "You know, with everything that happened, she stays in the attic most of the time." "The attic?" Carmen frowned. "That's where Mama's room was." Joel sighed heavily, pushing his food around his plate. "Rosa spends most of her time up there," he said. She says she feels closer to Mama in that room." Carmen's heart ached hearing this. "Poor thing," she whispered. "I should go see her." But Joel shook his head quickly. "No, it's best not to disturb her. She's been having some issues since Mama died." Carmen raised an eyebrow, sensing something was off. "What kind of issues?" Joel hesitated, but Maria jumped in, her voice hushed. "She started talking, Carmen. Rosa spoke for the first time since she was born." Carmen's eyes widened in shock. "What? But that's amazing. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Maria looked uncomfortable, her hands wringing together in her lap. It's not like you think. The first thing she said, it wasn't good." "What do you mean?" Carmen pressed, her voice growing more anxious. Joel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said Mama was calling for me." Carmen's breath caught in her throat. She looked from Joel to Maria, trying to make sense of what they were saying. "Are you telling me that Rosa heard Mama?" Maria nodded. "And it's not just that. Ever since then, strange things have been happening. Rosa's been acting different. She keeps writing down dates, the 15th of September, over and over again." Carmen felt a chill run down her spine. "That was the day I found out about Mama," she murmured. Joel's face grew even paler. "It's more than that, Carmen. Something's wrong in this house. I don't know how to explain it, but Mama hasn't left." Carmen blinked, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "She's still here," Joel whispered, his eyes darting toward the window as if expecting to see something or someone. "I've seen her. Rosa has seen her. She's come back." Carmen shook her head, trying to keep her composure. "Joel, that's not possible. You're just grieving. You're imagining things." But Joel's eyes were wide with fear. "I'm not imagining it, Carmen. I've seen her standing outside the window in the yard. She's waiting for something." Carmen stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back from the table. "This is insane," she said, pacing back and forth. "You're scaring me, Joel." Maria placed a hand on Carmen's arm, trying to calm her. "We didn't want to tell you over the phone because we knew you wouldn't believe us. But it's real, Carmen. There's something wrong in this house." Carmen turned to face them, her voice shaky. "I need to see Rosa. I need to understand what's going on." Joel hesitated, but finally nodded. "Okay, but be careful." Carmen made her way upstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the attic door, she paused, taking a deep breath before gently pushing it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. And there, sitting by the window, was Rosa. The little girl didn't turn to look at her aunt. She sat perfectly still, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. In front of her on the windowsill was a small piece of paper. Carmen stepped closer, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor. "Rosa?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rosa didn't respond. Carmen knelt beside her, looking at the piece of paper. It was the same as before. September 15th, written over and over again. "Rosa, sweetheart, why are you writing this?" Carmen asked gently, trying to hide the tremble in her voice. And then slowly, Rosa turned to face her. Her eyes were wide, but they seemed distant, as if she was seeing something far away. "It's not over yet, Auntie Carmen," Rosa said in that same clear voice. "She's waiting for someone else now." Carmen's heart sank as a wave of dread washed over her. Who is she waiting for? Rosa's lips parted, and in a voice that was almost a whisper, she said, "She's waiting for you." The words hung in the air, chilling Carmen to her core. She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving Rosa's face. The girl's expression remained eerily calm, as if she were simply stating a fact. Carmen stumbled down the stairs, her mind reeling. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. She needed to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, something stopped her, a cold, overwhelming sensation, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She turned toward the front door, but before she could reach for the handle, the lights in the house flickered, then went out. Carmen froze in place, her breath catching in her throat. In the darkness, she heard a familiar voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Carmen," her mother's voice. The room felt like it was closing in on her. She spun around, her eyes darting wildly, but she saw nothing, only shadows. "Mama?" She called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, but she could feel it, the presence, the coldness that seemed to seep into her bones. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a faint, ghostly figure standing at the foot of the stairs. It was Mrs. Mabini. Carmen's heart raced, her body paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. The air in the room grew colder and heavier, and Carmen felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had to get out. With all her strength, Carmen turned and ran for the door, her hands fumbling with the lock in the darkness. She yanked it open and stumbled out into the night, gasping for air. Behind her, the house stood silent, but Carmen knew that the presence inside was still watching, still waiting. Carmen ran into the street, her heart pounding in her ears. The cool night air did little to calm the fear that surged through her body. She turned to look back at the house, Joel and Maria's home, the house where their mother had died. It stood still and silent, but Carmen could feel its gaze like it was watching her, waiting. For a few moments, she stood frozen in the middle of the street, unsure of what to do. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. That wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But deep down, Carmen knew that it was. She had seen her mother's ghost, and she had heard her voice. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed Joel's number. It rang once, twice before he answered. "Carmen," his voice was thick with worry. "What happened? Where are you?" "I'm outside," she gasped, trying to catch her breath. "Joel, I saw her." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line before Joel spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "Mama?" Carmen swallowed hard. "Yes. She was in the house. Joel, she's still there." "I told you," Joel said, his voice shaking. "I told you she hasn't left." "What does she want?" Carmen asked, her voice desperate. "Why is she still here?" "I don't know," Joel replied, sounding as terrified as she felt. "But I think she's angry. She never forgave me, Carmen. She's here because I let her die." Carmen shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. "No, Joel, that's not true. Before she could finish her sentence, there was a loud bang from inside the house. Carmen spun around, staring at the front door. Joel, still on the phone, heard it too. "What was that?" "I don't know," Carmen whispered, her eyes wide as she took a step back. "Joel, something's happening in the house." "I'm coming out," Joel said, but Carmen stopped him. "No, stay inside. Don't come out," she warned. But it was too late. The front door creaked open and Joel stepped out onto the porch. For a moment, the two siblings just stood there, staring at each other across the yard. The air between them was thick with fear and tension, neither of them knowing what to say or do. Joel's eyes were wide, and his face was pale as he walked slowly toward Carmen. "I've been hearing things," Joel said, his voice barely audible. "At night. Mama's voice calling my name, and Rosa, she keeps writing the date, September 15th. over and over again. I know, Carmen whispered. She told me that Mama is waiting for someone else now. Joel's breath caught in his throat, and he looked at Carmen with a mixture of fear and confusion. Who? Before Carmen could answer, there was another loud bang from inside the house, followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the attic. Both Carmen and Joel turned to look at the house, their hearts racing. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, until they stopped right at the window of the attic. And then, slowly, the curtains shifted, revealing a shadowy figure standing behind the glass. It was Mrs. Mabini. Joel gasped, stumbling backward as Carmen clutched his arm. The ghostly figure of their mother stood still, her pale face partially obscured by the dark shadows of the room. Her eyes, empty and hollow, seemed to bore into them from behind the glass. "She's watching us," Carmen whispered, her voice trembling. "Joel, she's watching." Joel's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared up at the window. Why? Why is she still here?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I think she wants something from us," Carmen replied, though she wasn't sure what that was. As they stood there, frozen in terror, the figure in the window began to move. Slowly, methodically, Mrs. Mabini raised one hand and pointed toward them, her finger outstretched as if beckoning them to come closer. Joel shook his head, stepping back in fear. No, I can't do this. I can't." "We have to go," Carmen said urgently, tugging on his arm. "We have to leave this place, Joel." But before they could move, the front door of the house suddenly slammed shut with a deafening bang, as if something or someone was sealing them in. They both turned toward the door, their hearts racing. "What the hell is going on?" Joel cried, panic overtaking him. Carmen felt the cold grip of fear wrap around her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We need to get Rosa and leave. Now." Together, they rushed back into the house. The temperature inside had dropped dramatically, the cold seeping into their bones. The once familiar home now felt like a haunted maze, each shadow holding the promise of something terrifying. They climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last, and when they reached the attic, they found Rosa standing in the middle of the room, her eyes wide with fear. "I can't stop her," Rosa whispered, her small voice quivering. "She's coming." Joel rushed to his daughter's side, pulling her into his arms. "We're leaving, Rosa. We're leaving now." But as they turned to leave, a sudden gust of icy wind blew through the attic, slamming the door shut. The lights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. Carmen gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. "Joel, what's happening?" Before he could answer, the room was filled with a soft, eerie whisper. It was a voice, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. Joel, Carmen, it was their mother. The voice echoed through the room, filling every corner with its ghostly presence. Rosa buried her face in Joel's chest, trembling. "She's here," the little girl whispered. Carmen turned to look at the window, and there, standing just outside, was the ghost of Mrs. Mabini, her pale face pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes fixed on them. "Why did you leave me?" the ghostly figure whispered, her voice full of sorrow. Carmen felt tears prick her eyes as she stepped forward. "Mama, we didn't mean to leave you. We didn't know." The ghost of Mrs. Mabini didn't move. She simply stared at them, her figure flickering in the dim light of the attic. "You left me," she whispered again. "And now, you must stay." Suddenly, the room grew colder, the air thick with the presence of the supernatural. Carmen could feel it, the overwhelming sense of anger, of betrayal. Mrs. Mabini wasn't just sad, she was furious. "We're sorry," Joel cried, his voice breaking. "We didn't mean to." But before he could finish, the ghost lunged forward, pressing against the window as if trying to break through. The glass shook, and the walls of the attic seemed to close in around them. "We have to get out!" Carmen screamed, grabbing Joel's arm. Together they ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. In the corner of the room, Rosa began to cry, her small body shaking with fear. "She's not going to let us go," she whispered through her sobs. "She's never going to let us go." Joel, desperate, began pounding on the door. "Please, let us out!" But the only response was the sound of their mother's voice echoing through the room. "You left me, and now you must stay." Carmen, her heart racing, turned to Rosa and knelt beside her. "Rosa, sweetheart, I need you to help us. Can you talk to her? Can you make her stop?" Rosa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how." Carmen looked around the room, her mind racing. She had to find a way out before it was too late. Carmen's pulse quickened as the air in the room thickened with fear. Joel continued pounding on the door, his knuckles bruising from the effort, but the door didn't budge. Rosa sobbed quietly, still huddled against Joel's chest. The presence of their mother, the cold, oppressive energy that filled the room, grew stronger. Carmen knelt down, holding Rosa's trembling hands. She was trying to steady her own shaking, but the fear was overwhelming. "Rosa, listen to me," she whispered softly, trying to keep her voice calm. "You're the only one who can talk to her. She listened to you before. You have to try again." Rosa shook her head violently. "No, I can't. She's too angry. She won't listen to me." "You have to try," Carmen insisted. "If we don't do something, we won't get out of here." Just then, the temperature in the room plummeted even further. Carmen could see her breath in the cold air, misting as she exhaled. The ghostly figure of Mrs. Mabini was now pressing her pale, spectral face against the glass of the window, her hollow eyes fixed on them, glowing with an eerie light. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in on them with a slow, suffocating force. The whispers began again, swirling around the room. "Joel, Carmen, Rosa." Joel turned to Carmen, his face ashen with fear. "What do we do?" His voice cracked under the weight of the terror that gripped him. Carmen took a deep breath, steeling herself. "We have to face her. She won't stop until we do." "Face her?" Joel asked, incredulous. "She's not our mother anymore, Carmen. She's something else." Carmen knew he was right, but they had no other choice. The longer they waited, the stronger the presence grew. If they didn't confront whatever this was, they would be trapped here forever. "I'm going to talk to her," Carmen said firmly. Maybe I can reason with her. Tell her that we didn't mean to abandon her." Joel's eyes widened. "You can't. She won't listen. She's too angry." But Carmen didn't respond. She stood up and took a step toward the window, her legs trembling as she moved closer to the ghostly figure of her mother. The closer she got, the colder the air became and the more oppressive the energy felt. Every instinct in her body told her to run, to get as far away from the house as possible, but there was no escape. She had to do this. As she approached the window, Mrs. Mabini's ghost seemed to shift, her face twisting into something grotesque and unnatural. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and her eyes glowed with an intense, otherworldly light. Carmen recoiled, but forced herself to stay. "Mama," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Mama, please. I'm sorry. We didn't mean to leave you. We didn't know you were suffering." The ghost didn't move. It just stared at her with those hollow eyes, its body flickering and shifting like smoke in the dim light. Carmen took another step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "We were scared, Mama. We thought you were gone. We didn't know." Suddenly, the ghost moved. It pressed both of its spectral hands against the glass, the long, bony fingers scraping against the surface with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. Carmen flinched but didn't back away. "Please," she whispered. "Let us go. We're your children. You don't want to hurt us." For a moment, the air in the room seemed to still. Carmen held her breath, hoping, praying that her mother's spirit would listen. But then the ghost let out a low, guttural moan, its face twisting into a snarl. "You left me to die," it hissed, the voice echoing through the room, filling Carmen with a deep, paralyzing dread. "And now, you must stay." The glass in the window cracked under the pressure of the ghost's hands. Carmen stumbled backward, her heart racing. The room seemed to close in even more, and she could feel the walls tightening around them, like the house itself was coming alive. "Mama, please," Carmen cried, her voice breaking. "We didn't know. We didn't mean to leave you." Joel grabbed Rosa and pulled her toward the door, trying once more to force it open, but it was no use. They were trapped. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them in a cacophony of voices, all repeating the same haunting phrase, "You left me. You must stay. You must stay." Carmen could feel the presence closing in on her, the cold seeping into her bones. She turned to Joel, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to do something. She's not going to stop." Joel shook his head, his hands trembling as he pulled Rosa closer. "What can we do? She's too powerful." At that moment, Rosa looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I can stop her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Both Carmen and Joel turned to her, startled. "What?" Joel asked, his voice trembling. "How?" Rosa took a deep breath. her small hands clutching at her father's sleeve. She's angry because we left her alone. We need to show her that we're still here, that we still love her. Carmen knelt beside Rosa, her heart aching for the little girl. But how, Rosa? How can we show her? Rosa looked up at the window, where the ghost of Mrs. Mabini still loomed, her face twisted with anger. We have to tell her we forgive her. We have to forgive her for leaving us. Joel stared at his daughter, tears welling up in his eyes. Forgive her? Rosa nodded. She's angry because she feels like we abandoned her. But we didn't. We never stopped loving her. We just have to tell her. Carmen's heart swelled with both fear and hope. Could it really be that simple? Could forgiveness be the key to ending this nightmare? She stood up and faced the window, her hands shaking. Mama, she said, her voice soft but steady. We forgive you. We forgive you for leaving us. We know you didn't want to go. Joel, still holding Rosa tightly, joined in. We forgive you, Mama. We know you didn't want to leave. Rosa, her small voice trembling, whispered, I forgive you, Grandma. For a moment, nothing happened. The ghostly figure of Mrs. Mabini remained at the window, her eyes still glowing with anger. The air in the room was thick with tension, the cold biting at their skin. But then, slowly, the ghost's features began to soften. The twisted snarl faded, and her hollow eyes seemed to fill with a deep, aching sadness. The whispers in the room grew quieter until they faded away completely. The cold began to lift, and the oppressive weight that had pressed down on them for so long started to dissolve. Carmen watched in disbelief as the ghost of Mrs. Mabini slowly stepped away from the window. Her figure grew fainter, the edges of her body blurring as she began to disappear into the shadows. But before she faded completely, she turned her gaze toward her children one last time. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow and relief. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. And then, with a final flicker, she was gone. The air in the room warmed instantly, the cold vanishing as if it had never been there. The house was still, silent. Carmen let out a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face as she sank to the floor. Joel, holding Rosa tightly, collapsed beside her, his body shaking with relief. They had done it. They had faced their mother's ghost, and they had survived.